Good afternoon. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the Portland Art Museum and a happy Father's Day to all the fathers. So very exciting to have you here today. This year, as many of you know, we're celebrating our 125th anniversary, and I can think of no better way to commemorate this remarkable institution than opening the Shape of Speed on this very special weekend of celebrating fathers, and to host a lecture by the renowned automobile authority Ken Gross. As many of you may have seen or will see, the Shape of Speed features 19 extremely rare automobiles and motorcycles that truly move us. In fact, it was during the Great Depression that these forward-leaning, beautiful design of streamlined vehicles inspired a much-needed sense of hope for the future. Before I introduce Ken, I would like to recognize a number of our very generous sponsors for this show. They are Nanny Warren and the Swaggart Warren Foundation, Bill and Helen Jo Witzel, Washington Trust Bank, The Standard, Melvin Mark, Sports Car Market, Daimler Trucks of North America, Mercedes-Benz of Portland, Provenance Hotels, and the Dossier, among many others. And I'd like to give them a round of applause and thank them. This has been a true community effort. You know, this museum is supported by the private sector for the public good, and we had over 50 donors to this exhibition. And thanks in large part to some of our fundraising chairs and leadership volunteers, and they included Bob and Kathleen Ames, Kevin Blount, Keith Martin, and Jim Mark, and I'd like to recognize them as well for their efforts. Thank you. Now it gives me great pleasure to introduce Ken Gross. Ken is an historian, journalist, former director of the Petersen Automotive Museum in Los Angeles, as well as a lifelong car enthusiast. He is a 29-year chief class judge of Pebble Beach's Concours d'Elegance and a member of the very prestigious selection committee. Ken also judges car shows around the world and is including Amelia Island, Boca Raton, Hilton Head, Greenwich, and Hershey, among others. The author of 23 critically acclaimed books and museum catalogs, Ken also contributes to Auto Week, TheDrive.com, Hot Rod Deluxe, American Car Collector, and Old Cars Weekly. He has been Jay Leno's partner with Jay's columns in Popular Mechanics and Auto Week for several decades. Ken is widely recognized for his depth of knowledge, having received the Automotive Hall of Fame Distinguished Service Citation, the International Motor Presses Association's Ken W. Purdy Award, and the Motor Press Guild's Dean Bachelor Award, in addition to the Lee Iacocca Award. As many of you may recall, Ken was the guest curator for the Allure of the Automobile in 2011. He has also curated exhibitions of fine automobiles at other museums across the country, including the Frist Museum of Art in Nashville, the Indianapolis Museum of Art, the North Carolina Museum of Art, and the Museum of Fine Arts, Houston, among others. Ken and his wife, Trish, who is here today and is the president of the National Automotive Technicians Educational Foundation, are the only couple to be honored by the Automotive Hall of Fame. Their first date, as Ken told me, was on his Ducati motorcycle. Although he has owned 2 Ferraris, a Lamborghini, a Porsche 356, and 4 Morgans, Ken's garage today has 3 hot rod Fords from the 1930s and 40s. His favorite car in the Shape of Speed is the Bugatti Type 57 Aerolite, but he would happily drive any one of the automobiles or motorcycles upstairs, including the Airmobile. It gives me great pleasure to introduce and welcome Ken Gross to the podium. Thank you.
Thank you, Brian, and thank you all for coming today. I appreciate it, particularly on Father's Day. And what I'm going to try to do is tell you a few things about these cars that you might not have known, that maybe aren't even in the catalog, so that you'll be the experts. And perhaps when we do the next exhibition, one of you will be happy to take it off my hands. No, not really. Okay, we're calling it Behind the Headlights. And I think that's a good way to describe some of the interesting stories and tales behind these cars. That you already know, and so we can segue into streamlining. And in the 1930s, I like to say, and I'll show you something in a moment, that the automobile was barely 30 years old. You know, at the turn of the century, there were a few cars beforehand, but they were still coming along very much as an extension of carriages that had been drawn by horses. But around the automobile, which was becoming a little more sophisticated, were all these wonderful shapes. The railroad trains of the 1930s were streamlined, and people talked about streamlining and its importance. Aircraft, I mean, the DC-3 was designed, it first flew in 1935. So people looked to the skies for influence, for modernity. But streamlining found its way into everything, even mundane objects like this little radio, or this vacuum cleaner, and certainly this toaster, and a pencil sharpener. And I mean, would you really need a streamlined pencil sharpener? I'm not sure. But as Brian said, streamlining, particularly in the Depression, when times were tough, modernity seemed to be a promise of the future. Something better was going to happen. And these sleek shapes looked like tomorrow. Here's a Minneapolis Moline tractor. Even farmers were kind of encouraged to have a more streamlined shape. And the Minneapolis Moline was a combination of car and tractor. So if you could only afford a great tractor, you could still clean up, dress up, and take the missus into town in a Minneapolis Moline. Here's Barney Oldfield in the beginnings of streamlined racing cars, although he soon found that the low top on this golden Submarine made it very difficult when he was racing, particularly on those dusty tracks. So racing cars for a while would lose some of this sleek shape, and certainly the roofs. But streamlining was everywhere. I mean, you took the ferry, it was streamlined. Here's an Ahrens-Fox fire engine with a streamlined cab. This is an early hot rod from the late 1930s with a streamlined shape. And then there's this. So the inspiration for the shape of speed is streamlining. And a great deal of interesting efforts were being made with streamlining about the time, the decade, the 1930 to 42, that this exhibition covers. And as Brian said, we have 17 cars, 2 motorcycles, and they're sort of divided into functional streamlining as you come in, beautiful streamlining in the main gallery, and I know it says automotive oddities, but let's say unusual approaches to streamlining when you see the Steyr baby and the little aeromobile, and certainly the Hoffman. So one of the people who had an influence on our exhibition was Paul Geret, and you can only imagine in the late 1920s what people thought when this curious parade of streamlined shapes was rolling through Berlin. But in the United States, really the first manufacturer to have a semi-streamlined car. I mean, there were elements on a lot of cars that were streamlined, but the first manufacturer was Graham. Graham's the first car you see when you come into our exhibition, but this is the Blue Streak, and while it doesn't look too streamlined, the windshield posts are slanted, the fenders are sweeping and they're valenced, the grille is slanted back. It certainly was an effort to begin to take the boxy lines that we had become used to and smooth them out. So our first car that you see is the Graham Sharknose. Graham called it the spirit of motion, but the public quickly called it the Sharknose, and you can see why. It was designed by Amos Northup, and Mr. Northup, when you see pictures of him, he was an unusually shaped man. He was somewhat short, with a head that was a little bit larger, perhaps, than it should have been. And you see him in his kind of mousy glasses here, but he really was a futuristic thinker and a brilliant guy. Sadly, he was walking outside his house in Detroit in the mid-1930s after he had designed the Sharknose, sadly slipped, fell, and died subsequently from a concussion. So he never got to see how the Sharknose did in the marketplace, perhaps just as well, because it wasn't a huge sales success. I like to look at this car, and it's bold, it's attractive. The front looks like it's racing somewhere, and the rear looks like it's running to catch up. But this was a car that in the 1940s was a very bold statement. And Graham had a supercharged engine, six-cylinder supercharged. It was reasonably quick. And they did everything they could to promote this unusual design. This is a Graham Coupe. I would have happily had this car in the exhibit, but I've never seen one. And I think that only a handful of them were made. Three-window coupes were some of the neatest looking cars in the 1930s and 40s, but I've never seen this one. But I call your attention to this because the artistry that was used to sell these cars, the renderings and so forth, were absolutely beautiful. Graham was not the only one who took an artistic approach, but I think this is particularly nice looking. So here's what I'd like you to do. I'd like you to look at that nose. Let's see if we can make it happen. And you can see the sort of an abrupt angle. I knew this was going to happen because I knew I'd forget to turn this off. I apologize. But you see that I even have an automotive horn. This is my daughter calling to wish Happy Father's Day. And it is. I didn't want to miss her call, so I'll call her back. At any rate, what I'd like you to do is look at this slant, and now see if we can see it in this picture. And you'll see that the angle is not as abrupt. So that's the difference between 39 and 40, 38, 39, 40. Graham thought, well, if we just scale this back a little bit, we'll sell the hell out of these. Well, it didn't really work. But they tried all sorts of advertising. This was really the approach they had. They're saying, actually, it costs a little more than a low-price car, but it's worth it. And they also touted the fact that they had a supercharger, just like the fast aircraft of the day and so forth. Graham was not the sales success, and the company basically went out of business, but not before they even tried this. There's a little bit of cheesecake on the hood here. Now, this is a car that many of you have probably never seen. Are we doing okay here, or have I twisted myself out of a...
You want to call your daughter while I fix it?
I do. They call this technical difficulties. We good, Tim? I think, yes, we are. So here's a car that many of you may have never seen. I know Jay Leno hadn't seen it. It's probably never been west of the Mississippi River, and it's a 1934 Bendix SWC. SWC stands for Steel Wheel Corporation, which was a dummy company that was set up by Vincent Hugo Bendix. And Mr. Bendix invented the Bendix drive, which allows a flywheel to start a car and the drive separate from it. And he also did great work with brakes. And he had a number of companies, including aircraft companies. And like many people who've made a great deal of money in the automotive-related business, he wanted a car with his own name on it. So he hired a crack team of people to develop this car in secrecy. Well, one of the problems with being married to an Italian who's sitting in the front row is that I talk with my hands. And I should have said yes to the lavalier question, but I think if you'll bear with me, we'll do our best here. Okay. So the Bendix is here comes Tim again. I'm failing. Between not answering Kayla's phone call and messing up the mic.
Would you be okay with the handheld?
I'm going to have to be.
Okay.
Yeah, let's do that.
Okay. I'll give you that one. You can just, for the pack.
Are we there? We are. Great. Okay. So the Bendix had a lot of very interesting technical ideas. If you look at this car, it was actually lost for many years, and at the Bendix Corporation, it was like walled up somewhere. So it was rescued and cleaned up a bit, but it's still sitting on its original tires. And those tires are General Jumbos inflated to 8 psi. So they're part of the suspension. This car has fully independent suspension. It has a 6-cylinder engine mounted backward with a pre-selector 3-speed transmission so that you can select a gear, and then when you want it, you step on the clutch. It's got brakes that are integrated into the wheel hubs. So when you take the wheel and tire off, you could adjust the brakes. There are scoops on the outside for brake cooling, just any number of interesting things. The body is steel, the fenders are aluminum, the hood and deck are aluminum. But what I find interesting, and the reason we put it the way we did in the exhibition, is it was designed in the Detroit area at the same time as the Chrysler Airflow, which we'll talk about. The two designers did not know one another. They didn't know that they were each working on a similar designed, streamlined car. And I don't know that the two have ever been together. This car comes from the Studebaker Museum in South Bend, Indiana. It doesn't get out much, and it took several boards of directors meetings for them to agree to loan it to us. So I was really pleased to have it. Here's Vincent Hugo Bendix, and Mr. Bendix spent a great deal of money to have this car developed. And then when he did, he started realizing that if he put it on the market, he might alienate all the people in many, many companies that he was supplying brakes and brake parts to and starter parts. So they took it to Europe and showed it to a number of European manufacturers, ostensibly because he wanted to say to them, well, look, it's got a number of advanced features, and we can do this for you, or you could do it under patent. But he still hoped secretly that someone would say, you know, we'll build that car and we'll put your name on it. But it never happened. At the same time, in Detroit, Chrysler was building the Airflow. And the Airflow is often mentioned in the same sentence as the Edsel, as a car that had a great deal of development, but wasn't a huge sales success. In some ways, that isn't fair, because the Chrysler Airflow was really an advanced automobile for its era. It has a unit body. The wheels have been pushed to the corners, so the driver and passengers ride well in the wheelbase in a very smooth fashion. And of course, Chrysler was looking at the cracked trains of that era. This is the Pullman M10000 on your left, and the Burlington Zephyr, which inspired another car in our exhibition. I mean, people saw these trains every day, and Chrysler's reasoning was, well, these are the most modern thing on rails. Why wouldn't you want your car to look that way? They even did a photo campaign with the Airflow and the M10000. But it didn't work terribly well. The car was developed, you know, people say anything developed by a committee is like a camel. Somebody thought it should have this and should have that. But in this instance, the three men surrounding Walter Chrysler were really brilliant engineers. They'd come from Studebaker as a trio. They went to work for Chrysler. You can see Owen Skelton, Carl Zeter, and Fred Zeter and Carl Breer. And they worked for the first time that we know of in this company with a wind tunnel. And their advisor was none other than Wilbur Wright. I mean, who would know more about a wind tunnel than Mr. Wright? And they, after they got over the notion that their cars were more streamlined going backward than going forward, they began to redesign them. And as you can see here, they did some beautiful advertising. And in the spirit of advertising in that era, this car is a little longer, it's a little lower, the roof is a little more subtle. It doesn't look quite as big and blocky as the car in our exhibition. But Chrysler, like Graham, decided that the real problem with their sales being slow had to be the nose of the car. So they hired Norman Belgettis, who was a famous industrial engineer, and Mr. Belgettis designed a longer, more conventional nose. And you could order this nose if you had a 1934 car in 1935, and they would ship it to your dealer, who would then retrofit it to your car. Again, this wasn't one of Chrysler's best ideas. The car itself, though, if you drive one of these, it's astonishing. And we have a video of some of the things that Chrysler did to try to convince a market in that time that this car was every bit as wonderful and safe and fast as anything on the market. So there's a video next to the car where the airflow is pushed off a 110-foot cliff. You see it rolling down. It lands on its wheels. I don't know how many takes they had to do that. And then a guy jumps in it and drives off. There's also a brake test. We show that. What we don't have is the video that has a starlet in the back seat and a baseball pitcher winding up and throwing a ball to demonstrate the safety glass. And there's also one where there's a fellow in a cowboy outfit with a shotgun shooting out a tire at speed. Chrysler did everything that they could, but a lot of them were not sold. Today, airflows are in demand. I don't think I can take credit for that, but I've had them in a couple of museum exhibitions because I've driven them. They drive beautifully, and when you look back now, they make a great deal of sense. This one at Hershey was about $7,000. And while the market didn't respond as favorably as Chrysler wanted, other manufacturers did. So here is a Peugeot 402 in 1935-36, and as you can see, it looks a great deal like the airflow. And this next one might surprise you even more. That's the first Toyota. In the late 1930s, the Toyota AA, and it's like a shrunken version of the airflow. Interesting thing about the Toyota AA, I should tell you, is that because of the what the British used to call the recent unpleasantness, no AAs survived the Second World War. So Toyota had to, and they had once they became really successful, they built an exact replica of an AA. And the only one that survives today is owned by a friend of mine who has a museum in The Hague in the Netherlands. He found it in Russia, in Siberia, of all things. How it got there, nobody knows. So it's the only surviving AA, but there are several reconstructed cars. But you can see the Chrysler Airflow had pretty wide influence. The car that was probably the most successful from a sales point of view, streamlined car, is the Lincoln Zephyr. We have a lovely example owned by a fellow from Gresham, Oregon, Mr. Johnson. But the Lincoln Zephyr's inspiration was a car here, a show car called the Sturkenberg. It was designed by John Charter, a Dutch-born American designer. And Mr. Charter, as you can see, this is a rear-engine car with a sloping nose. When we go back here, look at that cut line on the Zephyr, and then look at the Sturkenberg, and you can see what Ford did here. Edsel Ford saw the Sturkenberg in an exhibition, and he saw a way to save Lincoln. Lincoln was building big, luxurious cars, but sales had slowed. They didn't have a modern look, and Cadillac was eating their lunch. So when Edsel Ford looked at the Sturkenberg, he and his designer, Bob Gregory, thought that they could take this lovely shape and the tail and so forth, forget putting the engine in the back. That didn't make a lot of sense to them. But what they would do is design a handsome new nose. So you can see the Sturkenberg outlines with the Lincoln Zephyr, which was an immediate hit. And the car we have is absolutely beautiful. It's streamlined, it's deco, and it put Lincoln back on the map. Now, while the Sturkenberg had a rear engine and a sleek shape, the people who were really doing it was a combination of Paul Jarret, a great aerodynamicist, and designers of all places, Czechoslovakia. So here is the solution to the entire streamlining problem. This was the work of Hans Ledwinka. So it's streamlined all the way. The engine is in the rear back here. It's a V8 with a magnesium block, magnesium crankcase. The floor of this car, so there's no drive shaft, it being rear engine, rear drive. It's a platform frame with a steel backbone, so it's eminently rigid. The only real problem with the Tatra was that the weight distribution is pretty much biased 35-65. So in a high-speed turn with the limited tires of the day on a wet surface, you might be reading your rear license plate in a Tatra. The car has, this is a T77a, it's the second generation, and it's a car that you can drive all day, 80, 90 miles an hour, on the beginnings of what the Autobahns were. Their advertising was absolutely lovely. They showed, you know, elegant women with these cars, beautiful renderings and so forth. The war, of course, put an end to Czechoslovakia's immediate automotive dominance in Europe, even though they probably had the most technically interesting car. And if you were at our event last night, Jay Leno mentioned the fact that when the Germans, who now had these shiny new Autobahns before they were bombed, wanted high-speed cars, they fell in love with the Tatras. So German officers commandeered these things, and immediately the accidents began. In a very short time, the joke was that the Tatras had killed more German generals than the Czech partisans. But lest you go away remembering that, think about how advanced the Tatra was, because it was really extraordinary. Let me go back one slide more on the Tatra. Just a funny thing that happened the other night in our exhibition. We have a few of the owners here, and it's wonderful when they can come and see the introduction and see people experiencing and loving their cars. So I was standing about 30 feet away from the Tatra when the rear engine cover, you could call it a hood, went up. I thought, oh my God, who would do this? And I ran over and met the owner and his wife, who I had only known from the telephone. The Tatra is one of the miracles of our exhibition because it was living north of Toronto, but its owners had moved to the United States. They kept it at a vacation home. They only visited for a couple of weeks in the summer. Luckily, I was able to call them when they were going to the vacation home, but we had to arrange for a Canadian transporter and the customs forms and so forth. It all worked out perfectly, and so the Tatra was here months before the exhibition started, stored in a friend's garage in Portland. Mercedes-Benz has an interesting streamlining approach. This is a 540K Streamlined, which in my bad German pronunciation means streamlined car. Most of the Mercedes-Benzes of this era were far from streamlined. If you remember in the allure of the automobile, we had an ultra-Baroque special roadster that looked, for the life of things, like a beautiful barn door going down the road. It certainly wasn't streamlined. Mercedes did build a handful of streamlined coupes. This is what they call the Autobahn-Kurier. I think they built 6 of them. Interestingly enough, 3 survive today, one of which we can't visit because it was owned by the Shah of Iran, and it's in the Iranian National Motor Museum. And you can see this online, that he had one. But like a lot of streamlined cars in this era, they wanted the identity of the brand, in this case, that big Mercedes grille, and the streamlining started somewhere around the windshield and went back. But in the case of this car that we have, the Mercedes Streamliner, it was commissioned by the German Dunlop tire company for high-speed testing on the Autobahn. And it has an aluminum body and a very sleek shape. The interesting story about this car is that somehow, after the war, I think it was owned by a GI, and then it disappeared for a long time. Somehow it was taken apart, and Mercedes-Benz has a series of museums with well over 1,000 cars stored. And they also have parts. Everything, as you can only imagine in a German company like Mercedes, is detailed, records are kept. During the war, for example, many of their trusted employees took their records home. And after the war, they brought them back. They were so sure, A, that someday the war would be over and that Mercedes-Benz would be back in business. Well, one of the archivists found he found a chassis, he found a transmission, he found a differential, and he found some other parts that were all linked to the number for this car. So they digitized the shape, and they built, just a couple of years ago, they built this beautiful aluminum body and reunited it with a 540K engine that they had. So here's this lovely car, and this is another part of the fun drama of doing these exhibits of automobiles in fine art museums. This car arrived on Wednesday last week. And I think it came at about 2 o'clock, and I arrived about 10 minutes of 2. All the other cars had been installed in the exhibition, but a week or so before this car was supposed to be here, there had been a little confusion on who was going to ship it, who was going to track it. But in their inimitable way, Mercedes-Benz flew the car, but they flew it to South Carolina. And we did point out that this wasn't Portland, Maine, that this is Portland, Oregon. So they had a team of drivers truck this car cross-country, and luckily it arrived exactly when it had to arrive. And it's a stunning piece, and it really makes the room, and we kind of made it by the skin of our teeth here. Here we are pushing it into position. You know, some of you might wonder, how do you get cars in this museum? And I'll tell you, it's a lot easier in this museum than most of the museums I work in, mainly because everything goes on the first floor here. I'm going to say just in quotes, they have to take down a series of glass doors in order to fit the car past the admissions desk and slither it through the doorways and move them around corners and so forth. But in a lot of the museums I work in, we have these elevators that are barely the length of a vintage car, so bumpers come off with the permission of owners, and other machinations are done so we can get cars in. Here, it's just hard labor. So remembering the airflow and remembering how Chrysler tried really hard to be a modern car in 1934, they didn't give up. They decided in 1941, which wasn't the most auspicious timing, to show what they then thought would be the car of the future. And here it is. We have the Chrysler Thunderbolt in our exhibition. They built 5 of these. They were nearly $9,000, and each of them was a different color. There was a red one, a black, a silver, and so forth. And this red car, which belongs to my friend Roger Wilbanks from Denver, Roger saw it when he was 5 years old. Chrysler toured the country with these cars, and although they were concept cars, they were fully functional, and so they sold them to people if they wanted. But during the touring phase, Roger saw this car as a kid. He remembers going to the dealership. He remembers the searchlights panning in the sky and his father lifting him up. And Roger is one of the preeminent car collectors in this country, and now he has the Thunderbolt he saw when he was a kid. He wanted to come to the exhibition, but he doesn't do email. And his secretary somehow missed the email I sent, so Roger, I hope, will be here in July or in August for your outside event, and he loves to tell the story of this car. So, car of tomorrow, why? Well, if you can look underneath here, here's the grille. It's kind of what we call a bottom breather. It has disappearing headlights. It has a steel top that folds, which was a first for American cars. And that's how it works. We're not able to demonstrate it here, but we've got some photography next to the exhibit so that you can see it. This was really advanced for 1941. It's got push-button doors, and as you can see, slab sides and this fluted side trim that wraps around the car. I mean, it was pretty modern for its era. This is Ralph Roberts, who was part of the LeBaron Company, and before it was absorbed by Chrysler, so they built elegantly bodied Duesenbergs and Lincolns and so forth. And as I was saying, this is not, let me go back, this is not the first time someone had done a folding top. Here is the Peugeot, just a few years earlier, designed by Georges Poulain, and we had a Georges Poulain car here in our last exhibition. They called this the Eclipse. And I guess because when you think about it, an eclipse hides the sun or the moon briefly, and then everything is normal again. They did some wonderful promotional materials for the Thunderbolt. They toured the cars around the country. And this is Alex Tremulis, who was the co-designer. And some of you may remember Tremulis' name because he was the principal designer of the 1948 Tucker. This is the 70th anniversary this year of the the Tucker, and we'll have a big class of them at Pebble Beach. Alex was a very, very creative designer, and he and Ralph Roberts did quite a job on the Thunderbolt. I don't have to make any excuses about this car. It's probably the most beautiful car we have in the exhibition. It's a Talbolago T150C SS. They really only made a handful. They were bodied by Figoni and Falaschi in Paris, two of the preeminent coach builders of the pre-war era. And cars like this are just stunningly beautiful. But this one I like to think of as a kind of under this lovely costume is an athlete, because this is a true sports car with a 4-liter, 3-carburetor, 170 horsepower engine and a 4-speed pre-selector. So people ran these in the GT class at Le Mans. They were serious sports cars. And of course, some days they weren't as serious when you had someone like Princess Stella Carpathala taking her lovely car to a Concours d'Elegance in Nice or Cannes. And here she is, and here she is with the car repainted in another costume, which was not unusual for the wealthy people who displayed these cars. And alongside the cars were women in fabulous ensembles. So you had the Coco Chanels and Jean Lanvins of the day creating ensembles to coordinate with the cars, the forerunner of say, what Pebble Beach does today. Figoni and Falaschi, if you look at this car and you look at our Delahaye, you'll see this little plate on the side. The idea was that it's like a coach builder's signature, and the coach builder wanted you to know, and the owner certainly wanted you to know, that this was a custom-built, bespoke car, and you could see that as the car pulled up if you were allowed to be that close. This is our 6C 2500 Alfa Romeo, and for those of you who look above and see what year it was built, yes, it was 1942, because Alfa Romeo assembled chassis almost up till the early part of 1943. I mean, the war was going on, but you know, these lovable Italians, they're not going to stop just because a war is happening. And if you had enough money or enough influence or a combination of both, you could get a 6C 2500. A cousin of Manfred Richthofen got one. A number of noblemen got them. And one lucky fellow got this car, which is a one-of-a-kind designed by Bertoni. And I just think it's absolutely stunning. And it has a number of post-war cues, like this horizontal grille or these fenders that are like an XK120 or a Bentley Continental. Bertoni built some beautiful cars after the war, and not everyone realizes how well they did even before the war. This car was loaned to us by Corrado Lopresto. Trish and I had an opportunity to visit his collection in Milan last year, and he has the definitive collection of custom-bodied Italian show cars. And although we didn't know one another very well, he was kind enough to loan this car, and he loaned it to us, committed to us early enough so that we could put it on a ship and get it here. It went through the Panama Canal to get here. The Italians knew that Portland was on the other side of the United States. I love the details on this car. I mean, the headlights are reminiscent of things you might see on a Porsche, perhaps. The grille is a little like a 42 Lincoln, but it was way ahead of its time. And it's the kind of car you want to put your arms around. It's just slinky and cool. But it's got a lot of muscle. This is a 2.5-liter, 3-carburetor, 130-40 horsepower engine, and these cars competed in rallies and in road races, so they were serious competition cars as well. This picture was taken, we think, in like 1942 or so, and I put it up just because it's extraordinary to think of what some of these cars might have been like had the war not interrupted the creative efforts. But we're very fortunate this car survived. It went to Switzerland, and then it came to the United States. Corrado Lopresto found it in California, brought it back to Italy, restored it to a fairly well, and we have it in our exhibition. And speaking of sensationally beautiful cars, here's the Bugatti Aerolith, which also has a very interesting story. By the way, this is a car that looks as though Jules Verne designed it. It's got fabulous lines, and if you can see the riveting and the fins, It's because the body is made of magnesium. I'm going to take a quick glass of water here and then tell you what that means. Thank you. Many of you probably know that Bugatti, although it's an Italian name, was a family that lived in Molsheim in the eastern part of France. Bugatti was trained as an engineer, but he was really more of an artist. And he came from a family of artists. His father, Carlo, designed Art Deco sensational furniture that you can find in some fine art museums today. This is Ettore, who, while looking a little foppish in this picture, designed that penny farthing bicycle. And the car behind it is the Type 57 that basically the same design that won Le Mans in 1937 and in 1939. And the chassis of that car is the same as the Aerolith in our exhibition. This is Rembrandt Bugatti. Can you imagine naming your kid Rembrandt? And thinking that maybe he'd become an artist. What he did become is one of the most fabulous bronze sculptors of animals the world has ever seen. And here he is working with one of his subjects. An immensely talented man. All of his bronzes look as though the animal is moving. So Jean was the youngest in the family, and there was a lot of onus on him to produce. He's 25 in this picture. And this is a car that he had designed. This is a Type 41 Royale, of which only 6 were built. They were the largest automobiles of their era. Each one had a different body. And Jean was extremely creative. And he designed the Aerolith along with a man named Joseph Walter, who worked at the Bugatti company in Molsheim. This is a picture of the Aerolith that we have in our exhibition at it was the star of the Paris and London auto shows in 1935. Bugatti built this elegant body because the Type 57 was a new chassis, and although they were known for their racing cars, they really wanted to sell convertibles and sedans and sports cars to the wealthy people who could afford their cars. Bugatti preferred that you paid in cash. There were very few dealers. There was one in Paris and one in Marseille. You were invited to come to Molsheim and stay at his private hotel, the Hotel de Pourcing, the Hotel of the Thoroughbreds. And Ken Purdy joked that if Ettore Bugatti didn't like your table manners, he wouldn't sell you a car. And he clung to mechanical brakes for a long time because he didn't believe in hydraulics. He reportedly said, "I build my cars to go, not to stop." So, if you can believe it. The Aerolith disappeared sometime before World War II, but not before an artist in the Bugatti factory painted this wonderful creme de menthe picture. So we know what the colors were like, and there are photographs that can be looked at. The interior, of course, is beautiful. I'll tell you a little more about that in a moment. The car this is the Aerolith after the London show, and if you look to the right and the left of this car, you can see how much like a spaceship it was with the square-rigged automobiles of its era. Ralph Lauren has the production version of the Aerolith called the Atlantic, and there was the Atalante, which was even a more luxurious version. The Aerolith that we have, the chassis is the earliest known Type 57. It's 57004. The body itself, made of magnesium, was reconstructed by a company called the Guild of Automotive Restorers in Ontario. The electron panels, the magnesium, was obtained from the Electron company, the very same company that supplied the panels to Bugatti. Magnesium, I'm told, it wants to, if you apply a torch to it, it wants to light itself on fire, and it also doesn't like to keep a shape once it's been, once the shape has been pounded into the metal, and as a result, David Granger from the Guild of Automotive Restorers told me that they asked the people at Electron how to mold the metal, and the people at Electron said, "Well, we can't really tell you. We have no idea how to do it. We can sell you the exact alloy, but we can't help. So it took them several years and 7 figures to build the car that we have. And here we are, tiptoeing through the sculpture garden to get it into the museum. Each one of these cars is special handling and an interesting bit of drama to do. In many cases, I have the privilege of starting them and driving them off the trailer, across the street, and into the sculpture garden. In this instance, we didn't start this car, although I have seen it run, and it's pretty fabulous. It belongs to Christopher Orstrom, who's the chairman of the World Monuments Fund. He travels around the world raising money to keep wonderful places like the Taj Mahal and Angkor Wat together. And in the meantime, he commissioned this car. It's never been in Virginia. He lives about 10 miles from where Trish and I live. But there's some tax issue. I hope no one's listening. So the car has always been in Canada unless it's been in a museum exhibition. Peter Mullen, who also loaned us the Talbot Lago, loaned us this really neat Panhard. And Panhard is the quintessential French car. Panhard was in business in the 1800s. They were one of the first car manufacturers, and they were kind of a medium-priced car. They occasionally ventured into a higher-priced vein. This was their sort of medium-priced sedan of the 1930s, and as you can see, the streamlining is everywhere on this car, and there's so many neat elements. If you look at the peak on this headlight, it's the same as the peak on the grille. The fluting is very artistic, and the car itself could be, you could order it with a steering wheel in the center, which is what they wanted you to do. They felt that with their panoramic windows, you can sort of see that, why not be in the center of the car and be able to see everything? But many of them were delivered with right-hand steering because the French thought that was pretty chic, and you'll see that that's true on our Talbot Lago and on our Delahaye. The car that we have is one of the rare ones, probably, with left-hand steering. This car has a sleeve valve engine. I won't go into the technical explanation of a sleeve valve, but suffice it to say, in order for the sleeve valve cylinders to slide up and down, they take a great deal of oil. So Panhard proceeds down the street in utter silence. That's one of the advantages of sleeve valves, but in a haze of blue smoke. This is Louis Bionnier, who was the designer, and here's Jay Leno's car, which it does have the steering wheel in the center. It's slightly off-center for the purists in the audience, but it's basically in the center of the car. Jay has not run this car, and he could tell you this in a lot funnier way than I can, but when you live in Los Angeles, if you're driving a car that's emitting a cloud of blue smoke, you're probably going to be sent to San Quentin. So he's actually thinking of substituting the engine in his car because the car's so beautiful. I mean, you want to be in it. Their advertising was elegant in the time period. They didn't sell a lot of the Panhard Dynamics, but today they're highly prized. This is an example of a coupe. I'd have dearly loved to have found one of these. They only exist in France. This particular car was at a famous auction a few years ago where a number of cars had been just allowed to sink into the ground for years in outdoor sheds. It was sold for a huge amount of money, and some lucky person is going to restore it one day. This is certainly one of the stars of our of streamlining as the most attractive art you can possibly have. This is a 135M Delahaye, the same chassis that was used for competition. It's a Figoni and Falaschi body again. These were made in very limited numbers. And this is how the process worked. I mean, you would go to Figoni in Paris and sit down much the way you might go to a Savile Row tailor to order a special suit, or to a couturier to have a wonderful gown. And they would show you sketches and colors, and then you would order the car, and it would take about 2,100 hours just to build the aluminum body. These are the guys who did it. This is Carrosserie Portu, very similar to Figoni. So these men don't look it, but they were really artisans. They could take a sheet of aluminum and pound it, bend it, stretch it, shrink it, and make a work of art like the car that we have in the exhibition. One of the tools they used is a 3 olives machine. And this is a great way to win a bar bet with car people, because most people think the English wheel is the only way to roll panels. But this was the French solution, and these 3 different sized rollers with 2 very skilled people, 1 on each side, could form the lovely fenders and contours that we see on the cars in this exhibition. There are only 2 of these being operated in the world today. One of them is in Wisconsin, the other is in Lyon, France. They're owned by a friend of mine, of all things, and he's trained his artisans to be able to roll panels with a 3 olives machine. The windshield on this car folds forward, but some of these Delahaye's, the windshield could be cranked down into the cowl for a low silhouette. This particular car, I like telling this story, and forgive me if you've heard it, but we bought this car when I was the director of the Petersen Automotive Museum in Los Angeles. Bob Petersen had a great eye for wonderful cars, and he had the wallet to match. And he wanted one of these, and when Bonhams came up with this car for sale, it was the cover car for one of their Pebble Beach auctions. And we were invited to an exclusive party that was held by Jacques Nasser, who was then the chairman of Ford Motor Company. And Pete said, let's go to the party. We can bid by phone. And in those days, all it took for Petersen to bid was a phone call to Bonhams and a handshake. So there we were at the party, waiting for the phone to ring, having cocktails. And the phone in those days, we had just graduated from bag phones to a phone that looked a lot like a World War II walkie-talkie. I mean, it was nothing that you put in your pocket. If you flipped it, you'd hurt the person next to you. But when it did ring, Pete took the phone, and he and I looked for a quiet place to take the phone call. We walked down the hall in this beautiful rented home on 17 Mile Drive, and we walked into a little girl's bedroom. So whenever I see this car, I think of Pete and me huddled over the telephone, listening to the bids going up in $100,000 increments, and looking at a sea of pink dolls and pandas. Finally, it got to $1 million, and he said, you know, what do you think? And I said, well, it does need some restoration work. And he said, where are we going to get another one? And I said, I don't know that we can, or we certainly don't know of one for sale. So it snuck its way up to $1.25 million. He bought it. He quietly put the phone wherever you put those phones in those days. We walked back in the dining room, and there would have been a lot of people who had been shrieking with joy. But Petersen was a really cool customer with gunfighter eyes and the patience to outwit a bear, which he once did. So he told Margie, and I told Trish, and nobody in the room knew that in those days he just bought $1 million car. Today, it would probably trade for north of $10 million. So like so many things Bob Petersen did, it was a great investment. And it's a thing of beauty. The entire tail panel lifts up, and the tail panel is the only thing on this car that isn't original. The car went to a buyer in Morocco after Figoni built it. It lived in Africa for many years, and it was purchased for 60 British pounds in the late 1970s, if you can imagine, and then restored, and here it is today. Some of these Delahaye's had Hermes interiors. I don't think this one does, but again, everything could be specified the way you wanted it, exactly the way you wanted it. Here's Madame Falaschi with a chauffeur. This particular car belongs to Miles Collier today. Most of them have survived, luckily, and as you can see, they're just beyond elegant. This is Kevin Cornish's A12 Cord. I'm very fond of the Cord. It was an extremely advanced car for its era. They called it the coffin nose because if you look at it, unfortunately, the square elements do look like a coffin. Gordon Burig designed it. The fenders are wonderfully round. It's a really great example of angular and curvaceous lines mixed well together. The pipes, the external exhaust pipes, are to help keep the heat from under the engine. There's a V8 motor built by the Lycoming Aircraft Corporation, 190 horsepower. It's front-wheel drive. There's a Switzer Cummins supercharger. There's a pre-selector gearbox, much like the ones I told you about our French cars. So highly advanced for its era and built in Indiana. Cord was priced the same way as a Cadillac, but they were a little smaller, and they used a series of wonderful ads, or at least wonderful if you read Fortune magazine and had the means to try to convince people. In this case, we have Daddy Warbucks here congratulating his son for buying a Cord. I mean, what kid could buy one of these cars in the middle of the Depression? But the ads tastefully reminded you that if you had the money and you had the judgment, the Cord was certainly your best choice and maybe your only choice. And it worked with celebrities, because here's Sonia Henney. She was the 1932 Lake Placid women's figure skating champion. And Amelia Earhart, I don't have to tell you about her claim to fame. So a lot of celebrities drove Cords. Now, this is a car most car enthusiasts have never seen. It's a Hoffman. Roscoe Rod Hoffman was a Detroit journeyman engineer. He'd worked for Packard. He'd worked for Studebaker. And he was commissioned, we now know, by the Studebaker brothers. When this car appeared in Special Interest Autos, Michael Am, who had a great sense of humor, called it the Supreme What's-It. But it was an effort on the part of the Fisher brothers, who were the General Motors bodybuilders, to possibly enter the market with an advanced rear-engined aerodynamic automobile. So they built this prototype, and in order to keep the size to a reasonable length, it has an X-shaped 8-cylinder engine. It's like two V4s hooked together. It sounds like a V8, makes kind of an interesting lopey idle, but it doesn't take up a lot of space in the rear. So this is Joseph Ledvinka, the cousin of Hans Ledvinka, who designed the Tatra, and here's Joseph putting the body panels together for our little Hoffman. Streamlining did not mean that you had to have an expensive car. This is a Steyr baby, and it was a counterpart to the Volkswagen in the late 1930s. Steyrs were made in Austria, and our little Steyr actually is, while it's the same size as a Volkswagen, it has a little bit more space inside, and as you can see in the rear where the Volkswagen would have its engine, the Steyr has luggage. But there's quite a bit of room inside. And the shape it's not only darling, it's quite streamlined for its time period. The engine, like a Volkswagen, is a horizontally opposed 4-cylinder, but in this case, it's water-cooled and it's mounted in front. The Stout Scarab is a car that people love to see because William Bushnell Stout, who designed the first all-metal airplane and made all of his money supplying Henry Ford with a very clever first passenger plane, decided, like so many people, he really wanted to get into the car business too. He wrote a wonderful biography because his life was filled with interesting inventions. Not all of them were successful, but they were all fascinating, and they were innovative and imaginative. With the Stout Scarab, he envisioned a car, wheels to the corners, engine in the back, large passenger compartment, movable, reconfigurable interior, so you could slide seats around, fold down a table. If you're thinking minivan, you're right. This really was the forerunner of the minivan. But in 1935, and 36, when the Stout first appeared, it was $5,000. So a new Ford sedan was $550, and this was $5,000. So not many people bought them. And despite the fact that Stout took them all over the country demonstrating them, they were not a commercial success. And people kind of forgot the idea. Stout took out ads in Fortune, full-page advertising, and he talked about, he almost challenged the car companies in America. He said, someday you will be building a car that looks like this. Well, early 1980s is when Chrysler developed the minivan. So it took a long time for that ad to take hold, but he was right. The interior is terrific, and yes, if you think that that's a wicker headliner, you're right. There's a number of innovative features in the Scarab. I think our safety people would look askance at the fact that the chairs slide around. And here's a lady defying any DOT rules by lying comfortably on the divan, but Stout, when you think about it, Stout really had a vision. The Stout in this exhibition belongs to Ron Schneider. Only 6 of these cars were ever built. Ron owns 2 of them. 5 of them survive. 1 is in the Detroit Institute of the Arts, and we're very fortunate to have this car because Ron likes to drive it in the summer, so it took a lot of begging and pleading to get it. Just one more shot of how versatile the interior is in the Stout. All the comforts of home, they'd say. Now, for those of you who think you've seen everything in streamlined cars, this is a 1937 Aeromobile. It was designed by Paul Lewis, and Lewis was an aircraft engineer as well. John Charter worked on the body design with him. His thinking was that by the mid-1930s, the airplane was something that got everyone excited. So why not have a car that used aircraft technology, even if it couldn't fly? So they built the first prototype and drove it around the country, and you can see from the nose why it didn't catch on. They redesigned it to a little more palatable approach than what they have here today. This car is the one and only. Mr. Lewis put 45,000 miles on it going around the country, trying to convince people to be buyers, maybe even investors. And while that wasn't successful, thankfully, the car survived. This little door in the back is where the luggage goes, and it can hold quite a bit. He even patented some of his ideas. And there you can see the door open, so that's where the luggage would go. And although he didn't sell but one of the Aeromobiles, after the war, Mr. Lewis built a car he called the Fascination. This time he put the double wheels in the back and the single wheel in the front. Unfortunately, he had the same result. And I'm not looking to kind of make fun of Mr. Lewis. I think that his Aeromobile is a nice example of aircraft principles adapted to the automobile. And if you stand on the corner up there in the gallery and where that Aeromobile is, almost everybody smiles when they come around the corner to see it. I do too. We have 2 motorcycles in our exhibition, and we're nearly done, and you can ask questions if you'd like. This is a 1930 Henderson, but much more stylistic than any 1930 Henderson ever was. It was built by Orley Ray Courtney, who was a master metal man. The body is steel. He did this with a power hammer. I mean, you might do that with aluminum pretty well. Very hard to do in steel. He even patented his ideas. He started with a 1930 Henderson KJ, put on low 14-inch fat wheels, and he designed this wonderful body for it. So it has a 4-cylinder engine. Unfortunately, it was not a sales success. You're going to think that's the theme of this exhibition, not a sales success. But people looked at it, and it was way ahead of its time. So this is the post-war effort from Mr. Courtney. And believe it or not, that's what we looked like when we drove, when people drove motorcycles in the 40s. They wore that cop hat and the funny outfit. And here's his $5,000 post-war dream, no sale. Even on the cover of Cycle magazine, no sale. Even with this attractive lady, same result. The BMW R7, which is in the entryway as you come into the museum, is a bike that still has people excited. It was built a little earlier than 1937, and it was done as a concept motorcycle to show what BMW could do. BMW had made motorcycles since the World War I era. In fact, after World War I, the motorcycle division really saved the car company because that's what they used to kind of get back into automobile production. And this bike is stunning. It's an 800cc, horizontally opposed, with these lovely panels. There's a video that shows Jay Leno and Klaus Kutscher talking about it in the entryway as you come in. It was way ahead of its time and very attractive. Here's Klaus with it at Pebble Beach. But what's interesting and the kind of behind-the-headlights story here is that this car was created in the 1930s, and again, because of the war and other things that happened, they forgot all about it until just a few years ago. Someone unearthed this crate. They found this lovely bike. BMW's engineers restored it, and we're very fortunate to have it in the exhibition. It comes in its own crate, and I have had the privilege a couple of times of helping put it in and put it out. If you think I'm smiling and happy in that picture, It's because doing these exhibitions is a privilege. It's fun to share the cars and the motorcycles. I thank Brian immensely for the opportunity to do an exhibit for a second time here, and I'm happy to answer any questions that you might have. Thank you.
Thank you, Ken. And we have time for 2 or 3 questions, and we do have microphones on either side of the auditorium. So if you could wait for the microphone to reach you, everybody will be able to hear the question.
Ken, could you explain the difference between streamlining and aerodynamics?
How much time do you have? Well, I think a fundamental answer to that would be that the two encompass the same phrase in a way, but aerodynamics is really a science. You know, that might be the best way to distinguish it. Many of the let's say objets, cars, airplanes, things that are streamlined, in some cases the look, like the French love the teardrop shape, the look is what it's all about. Aerodynamics would involve wind tunnels and testing and perfecting a shape that might not always be as pretty, but would be aerodynamically efficient. That's probably the best I can do in these circumstances, given that I have a daughter to call.
And there's a question down near the front.
Excuse me?
Yes.
Oh.
Ken, the Graham looks as though it has Fresnel lenses on the headlights. Could you talk about that?
Would you repeat that, please?
The Graham's headlights?
Yes.
Are those Fresnel lenses?
I wish I knew the answer to that.
That's the French theatrical lighting designer. He designed all the lighthouse lenses.
Well, they look like prismatic lenses in some capacity, and I'm sorry I don't know the answer to that, but I'm going to look it up and try to find out. So, thank you.
And we have a question here at the back.
Where would you put Buckminster Fuller's vehicle?
Well, if Jackie Frady had loaned it to me, I would have put it right in here. But it's not a vehicle that they loan out very much. For the gentleman is referring to a 3-wheeled car that Buckminster Fuller designed, and he too, like so many of these people, wanted to build a streamlined car of tomorrow. Unfortunately, when they were testing this car, there was a fatal accident, and I think Jay referred to this last night. It kind of put the kibosh on people wanting to buy this car. The National Automotive Museum, who loaned us the Aeromobile, they have one of Fuller's Dymaxions, and there are several replicas, including one that Jeff Lane has at the Lane Motor Museum. I'm not sure we could have gotten it through the door. You know, it's taller than any of these vehicles, but would I have liked to have had it? Absolutely.
Is there one last question? No? All right, well, thank you
Thank
again,
you all
Ken.
very much.
And Ken will be just outside of the auditorium signing books if you're interested.
I forgot to tell you that we are selling books in the gift shop. So time for the commercial. If you'd like a signed copy of the book, please come to the gift shop and I'll be signing them.